Well, Forest Owners Association says taxpayers are likely to have to pay billions of dollars for imported carbon credits if planting production forest will be restricted with the idea of protecting farming. Now, the Forest Owners Association President Phil Taylor will join us shortly. He has talked about a quarter of the forest estates already being in these particular classes. This is classes 6 and 7 land. For those who are watching who are unfamiliar, this is extremely steep hill country. If foresters were allowed to plant on these harder non-arable land, then the understanding from the Forest Owners Association is that these imported credits would, of course, not protect farming at all. And joining us now is President Phil Taylor. Phil, can you give us a little bit of an understanding around where this opinion comes from in this restriction to planting production forests?
Yeah, good evening, Sarah, and good evening, viewers. Look, there have been a number of political parties leading up to the election who have responded to pressure coming from the farming sector to put controls on afforestation in New Zealand. And so that's basically raised some concerns amongst the forest industry. You know, our view is that forestry is an equally valid land use to farming on those classes 4 through 7.
Okay, so let's talk about these calculations that you've done in terms of paying billions of dollars for imported carbon credits. How will these be far more expensive than us reaching carbon neutrality by 2050 on our own bat?
Well, as you know, the New Zealand ETS and the New Zealand government's commitment to climate change is an extremely complicated issue. But basically, the New Zealand government has 3 options if it's going to meet its 20 to 50 goals. One of the options is to pull out of their commitment to climate change globally, and clearly that's not going to be palatable. The second option is to plant trees, which is our preferred option, and the third option is that the government will have to go out onto the international market, or will most likely have to go out onto the international market and purchase carbon credits internationally.
Okay, what about the argument of reducing rather than offsetting?
Yeah, I mean, you know, long-term forests are not the solution. If New Zealand is truly committed to meeting its climate change objectives, it will need to find more permanent ways of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. And those are both from carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide.
And what about in terms of highly erodible land? How are we going to actually ensure that there is environmental protection around this? I mean, you talk about it being, you know, class 6 and class 7 land, but a lot of this is actually highly productive beef and sheep properties as well. And for a lot of young people being able to have that opportunity to get into farming. Do you believe that we should just cover anything that's too steep to farm when we do have a track record for many decades on being able to achieve so?
Look, I think, there's been a lot of debate around the role of permanent carbon forestry versus traditional production forestry combined with carbon farming. And forest owners' view is that there certainly is a place for permanent carbon forestry on those more highly erodible and remote areas of class 7 and 8 land. We don't subscribe to the fact that all land in classes 4 to 6 should be reserved for farming. Forestry is an equally valid land use, and the recent report by PwC demonstrated, in fact, that in terms of the economic return per 1,000 hectares and the jobs created, forestry far exceeds farming.
It's an interesting one to be able to convince, and I think it's an interesting one in terms of going into the election as well. Phil, how do you feel that forest owners' future is around going into the future without New Zealand First there alongside you, with the Billion Trees program being a very big part of seeing this plantation spread across the country?
Well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge on behalf of forest owners all the good work that Minister Jones has done. He's probably been the best advocate for forestry in the last 30 years. But putting that aside, we believe that eventually the reality will dawn that if New Zealand is committed to its climate change objectives, it is going to have to plant more trees. There's no if or buts. And as I mentioned earlier, the other alternatives are to purchase credits internationally and see all those funds go overseas, or to abandon part of, if not most of, New Zealand's climate change ambitions.
What about the idea, when I had a yarn to James Shaw the other day, that he is looking at native trees coming into this and he is looking at riparian planting? Is this particular message coming from forest owners, that last grasp in terms of that pines are the be-all and end-all in terms of achieving, and that you're not acknowledging that there is other ways of sequestering carbon?
Look, we have never acknowledged that there's only planting trees as being the only way to sequester carbon. The reality is our climate change goals are so ambitious that we're going to have to use every tool in the toolbox to take advantage of forestry, whether it's indigenous planting, whether it's native planting, whether it's exotic planting, whether it's in plantation forests, or whether it's in riparian strips. We need every tool available. And, look, Sarah, the irony of me is not lost that later tonight, I understand that you're interviewing Minister O'Connor, and he's talking about applying 50 million New Zealand dollars to basically assist farmers in reducing regulatory burdens. This is somewhat ironic that at the same time we're hearing governments talking about imposing more regulation on forestry, which really is one of the silver bullets, at least in the short term, for New Zealand's climate change ambitions.
And when you say about the increase in regulation, in terms of the safety record around forestry and in terms of the environmental degradation and management of forestry, would you argue that forestry does still have some work to do?
Yes, of course it does. But I think in terms of health and safety, we should reflect on the amazing progress that the forest industry has made over the last 7 years. In fact, now forestry is significantly lower in terms of its health and safety record compared to agriculture, construction, and other high-risk industries. In terms of environmental performance, I'd be the first to acknowledge that Tolaga Bay has been our Achilles heel, but the forest industry has stepped up to that. It's taking responsibility for that. And in most other areas around environmental performance, forestry is second to none in terms of the land use.
Mm-mm. And lastly, for those who have the argument that forestry is sequestering carbon for X amount of period of time yet to be cut down and that carbon to then be eroded back into the environment, is this really just a lock-up for the short-term policy for the long-term problem that we have?
Yeah, as the Forest Owners Association will be first to acknowledge, and I've made it previously in our interview tonight, that forestry is a long-term solution to New Zealand's climate change issues. There have to be other ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And agriculture has a very important part to play in this, given that it makes up 48% of New Zealand's emissions. So I think the part of the problem is the debate has become incredibly polarized, and we're getting the pro-forestry, the pro-farming. What we need to do to make progress is to actually engage collectively and actually work out solutions that can help New Zealand farmers, New Zealand foresters, and New Zealand Incorporated basically address its climate change challenges.
What I'm hearing from you, Phil, is that it's not an and or. We're all in this together, and it's about time we actually start to understand how this can happen. But you can understand the threats on both sides to have that open-minded conversation that needs to happen. To me, forestry, and the way you describe it, is like a sponge mopping up a wet floor that eventually needs to be wrung out.
I think that's probably quite a good metaphor, Sarah.
So therefore, in terms of a short-term solution, it's there. And of course, we need to wrap around an industry. Lastly, Phil, before you go, the processing of our wood here on our shores, does that concern you that we do not have the infrastructure to add value here if we are going to utilise this as a sponge for our carbon problem?
Yeah, I mean, the forest owners would all dearly love to see more domestic processing in New Zealand. And the New Zealand Coalition Government's announcement recently to favour wood over concrete and steel is a long way towards doing that. There's no point in propping up domestic processing simply to prop it up. The best way to do this is to stimulate demand. And again, we would like to applaud the New Zealand government in this area. We think they've got it wrong in the carbon space, but in terms of domestic wood processing and encouraging more processing onshore, we think they've got it right.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's President for the Forest Owners Association, Phil Taylor.
This is Sarah's Country.